The autumn of 1815 had come early to London, and the candles in the great room of the Royal Society for Learned Arts burned with the particular urgency of gathered men who do not feel the cold. They were fellows, most of them, and they wore that confidence the way they wore their coats, fitted, pressed, and entirely unearned by the evening. Miss Dorothea Pembridge stood at the edge of the room with a letter of introduction in her gloved hand and a cloak on her shoulders that had seen better decades, and she was aware, having been made aware 3 times now in the last quarter hour by the shift of eyes and the withdrawal of smiles, that she was not the sort of person the society expected at its autumn reception. She had not come for the reception. She had come for the Duke of Streatham. He stood near the fire at the room's far end, a tall man with dark, close-cropped hair and gray eyes that moved through the crowd the way a surveyor's instrument moves across a field, steadily, without warmth, noting everything. She had been told he was the Society's most influential patron, the man who decided which work received the press's attention and which gathered dust in a clerk's drawer. She had been told he was cold. She had not been told he would see her before she reached him, would register her worn cloak and her plain cream gown and the fraying hem that had given way at the left side despite her best mending, and would say, in a voice that carried precisely as far as it needed to carry, "I was not aware the Society had extended its charity to the academically bereaved." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone has been struck in public. Dorothea did not look down. She did not color. Though she felt the blood rise at her throat, she held the letter steady in her hand, and she said, without raising her voice, "I believe you will find this is a letter of introduction, Your Grace. Not a petition for alms." She extended it. He looked at it. He did not take it. "Fenwick," he said, and turned to a smaller man at his elbow. "See to it," and walked away. In the silence he left behind, Dorothea watched his retreating back, the midnight blue of his tailcoat precise against the candlelight. She had been dismissed in many rooms and in several languages. This particular dismissal she filed away with the others, in the part of herself that kept accounts. What she did not see, because he had already turned, was the moment after. The fraction of a second in which the Duke of Streatham's forward motion stilled, in which his gray eyes cut back, briefly, and without his permission, to her face. Stay with the story of what came next, if you will. Because what was sewn into that hem was going to change everything in that room. She had come to London with 1 trunk, her father's manuscripts, and £19. The trunk held 3 gowns, a dictionary of German she had used so often that the spine had been repaired twice with brown paper and paste, and the cloak, which was not her cloak at all, strictly speaking, but had belonged to her father, Professor Edmund Pembridge, who had worn it to lectures and to concerts, and to the courts of minor German princes who had the good sense to value what the English academic establishment consistently overlooked. Professor Pembridge had been a musicologist of rare precision and absolutely no commercial instinct. For 30 years, he had studied and catalogued the Baroque counterpoint tradition, had spent 11 months at the court of a German prince whose patronage was generous and whose enthusiasm for fugue structure bordered on the devotional, and had returned to Bath with a trunk of manuscript pages and a cloak that smelled of pipe smoke and foreign winters. He had died in April of a fever contracted on his last research journey, having completed his definitive treatise and left behind, in addition to the manuscript, debts totaling £340, and a daughter who had nursed him through his final weeks with the particular competence of someone who has had no one else to rely on. Dorothea had sold the better cloak in May to pay the surgeon. She had kept her father's cloak because of its smell. If she was being honest, the faint ghost of his tobacco pressed into the wool, the particular weight of it on her shoulders that was so much like the particular weight of having been loved carefully by an impractical man. She had not looked closely at it since she put it on. If she had, she might have noticed the hem, the slight stiffness at the left side just above the fraying edge, the faint crackling that had nothing to do with the wool. She did not notice. She had other things to notice. Mr. Josiah Fenwick, who had received the Duke's instruction with a weary patience that suggested he received many such instructions, led her to a side table, poured her a glass of wine, and took her letter with both hands and the air of a man who was doing something small he knew to be right. He had silver hair and a slight stoop and eyes of an elderly blue, and he had published, years ago, a monograph on the relationship between Handel's late work and the German court tradition that her father had cited 17 times across 3 separate manuscripts. "I knew Edmund Pembridge," Fenwick said when he had read the letter. "Then you know his work," Dorothea said. "I know it is important." He folded the letter carefully. "Whether the society knows it remains to be established." "That is why I am here," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read, something between appraisal and apology. "The society," he said, "can be difficult to enter." "I have noticed," she said, and allowed the smallest possible smile. "I intend to enter anyway." He introduced her to 3 fellows before the evening was done. The first was pleasant and distracted, and spoke exclusively about his own work on Monteverdi's lesser cantatas. The second was a younger man named Mr. Crow, not yet 30, who had been listening to her conversation with the first fellow, and who said, when she observed that the standard attribution of a particular counterpoint technique to the Frankfurt school was almost certainly 3 decades too late, "That's a strong claim, Miss Pembridge," in a tone that meant he thought it was incorrect. She explained why she believed it was not incorrect. She cited 3 manuscripts she had read, and one she had personally transcribed from her father's notes. She explained, precisely and without raising her voice, where the received attribution had first gone wrong, and why no one had noticed. Mr. Crow listened. He did not appear to enjoy listening, but he did it. At some point during this exchange, Lady Euphemia Grantham drifted past on the arm of her niece, Miss Arabella Vane, who was wearing ice-blue silk, and the particular expression of someone who has been told all her life that she is the most interesting person in any room and has begun to believe it absolutely. Lady Euphemia's pale blue eyes swept across Dorothea and moved on, and then, in the interval between one breath and the next, she leaned toward her niece and said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than Arabella's ear, but aimed, as Dorothea understood later, when she had replayed the evening more times than she meant to carry just a fraction further. "A scholar's cast-off. Fenwick's doing, no doubt. He does collect strays." Arabella's calculated pale gray eyes moved to Dorothea's cloak and back to her aunt, and she said nothing, but the slight compression of her lips said what words would have been wasteful to say. Dorothea did not hear this. She was still talking to Mr. Crow. What she did not see, from where she stood with her back to the room center, was the man who stood 30 feet away with a glass he had not touched since she had begun speaking. The Duke of Streatham, who had dismissed her 20 minutes earlier, who had not moved, whose gray eyes had not moved. "Who?" when she finished. And Mr. Crow said, "I concede the Frankfurt attribution is murkier than I thought," turned away from the conversation he had been conducting, set down his untouched glass, and found Fenwick. "The Pembridge girl," he said. "What is the manuscript she spoke of in her letter?" Fenwick told him. The Duke said nothing else. He walked away. The society held its autumn dinner 3 days later in the wood-paneled dining room of its Mayfair house, where the candles were more numerous and the conversations more guarded than at the reception. Dorothea had been invited, which surprised her. She learned later that Fenwick had arranged it, quietly, by suggesting to the secretary that Miss Pembridge's scholarly credentials merited a fuller hearing before any decision on the manuscript was made. She wore her second-best gown, the pale green one with the slightly altered sleeves, and she carried no pretense about the gown being adequate to the room. It was not adequate. Lady Euphemia's garnets were, and Miss Vane's pearl drop earrings were, and the assembled wives and daughters of the fellows with their silk and their cashmere shawls were. Yet Dorothea had learned some years ago that adequacy in clothing was a game she would lose, and that the correct response was to stop playing it. She was placed, by some arrangement she did not understand until too late, next to the Duke of Streatham. He spoke to the man on his other side for the duration of the soup course. Dorothea spoke to a retired fellow named Mr. Hastings, who had known her father briefly, 30 years before, when they were both students, and who had the gentle confusion of a man not entirely sure which decade he was in. She was patient with him, and kind in the way she corrected a memory he had confused, and she did not look toward the Duke. The Duke, for the duration of the fish course, said nothing at all. It was Arabella Vane, seated across the table and slightly to the left, who broke the silence. She was speaking to the woman beside her, in a conversation Dorothea was not meant to overhear, in the sense that it was aimed precisely at being overheard, about a lecture she had attended the previous week. "One does have such sympathy," Arabella said, "for the children of men who mistake enthusiasm for achievement, a scholar's cast-off at the season's functions. It is very sad, really. One ought not to stare." A pause fell around Arabella that was not quite silence. He did not turn his head toward her. He turned it, slightly, and with great deliberateness, toward her. "What is the manuscript?" he said. Not a question. A command. She looked at him for the first time since the reception. He was looking at her in the way that she had learned, in schoolrooms, in her father's study, in 3 years of trying to be taken seriously in rooms that did not want her there, to distinguish from ordinary attention. It was the look of a person who was actually listening, who had already discarded whatever he had expected to hear, and was ready for what she would actually say. It is a treatise on the development of counterpoint technique in the Northern German court tradition from 1690 to 1750, she said. My father spent 30 years on it. The final draft is 420 pages, annotated, with 53 original musical transcriptions. No comparable work exists in the English language. I am aware of that, he said. Fenwick showed me the first 40 pages. She was quiet for a moment. And? He was quiet for a moment as well. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a decision and not quite a recognition. It is serious work, he said, as though the words cost him something to admit. It is, she said. The society will not publish it without a patron, he said. You have no patron. I am aware of that also, she said. I am working to address it. By presenting yourself at receptions in a borrowed cloak. The cruelty of it was so exact, so precisely calibrated to find the gap in her composure, that she felt it land before she could decide how to receive it. Her hand was flat on the table. She did not allow it to close into a fist. By presenting my father's scholarship to the people with the power to publish it, she said. The cloak is my business. He said nothing else that evening. He turned back to the man on his other side, and the remainder of dinner passed as dinners do, loudly and at length, with very little said. That night, in his study on Grosvenor Street, the Duke of Streatham sat for a long time at his desk. The house was quiet. The fire had burned low. On the corner of the desk sat a small music box, silver and rosewood, with an enameled pastoral lid that had developed a crack along one edge from the journey that brought it here. He wound it, once, with the key he kept in his waistcoat pocket. He did not open it. He did not play it. He had received the box from his sister Cecily, who had pressed it into his hands when he came to retrieve her from her husband's house. She had needed both hands free, she said, to manage the stairs. He suspected she had given it to him because she knew he would keep it, in the way that she knew, as she had always known since they were children, what he would keep and what he would lose, and what he would stubbornly refuse to do either with. The man she had married had come with every credential a man in his position ought to have had. Good family, good name, good income, a manner so polished it left no surface imperfect. Gideon had vouched for him. He had sat across from his sister and told her this man was a worthy choice. He had believed it. He had been wrong. So precisely, so completely wrong, that the wrongness had rearranged something in him, had built a wall between himself and his own judgment, a wall he climbed each morning by telling himself he would not again mistake the surface of a thing for its substance, would not again see a polished presentation and call it evidence of character, would not again let himself be moved by the appearance of merit when he could not verify the merit itself. He picked up the first 40 pages of Pembridge's manuscript, which Fenwick had left on his desk 3 days ago. He turned to page 7 and read the passage he had marked. Then he turned back to page 1 and read from the beginning. The Society's board met on a Thursday. Dorothea waited in the corridor outside the meeting room, with the composure of someone who has been waiting in corridors for a very long time and has made peace with what corridors are. Mr. Hartley Oates, the secretary, came out at the appointed time and said, in the manner of a man carrying a verdict he did not enjoy delivering, that the board had reviewed the submission and found it to be of scholarly interest, but that the society could not undertake publication without a confirmed patron, and that no patron had come forward to sponsor the work. I see, Dorothea said. Miss Pembridge, the society is not in a position to extend charity. No, she said, with a steadiness that closed the sentence before it could reach its destination. No, I understand the policy. She understood it. She had understood it since the reception. What she had allowed herself for 3 days to half believe was that the manuscript might speak loudly enough to move the policy. It had not. She had also allowed herself, in the weaker hours of the previous 2 nights, to half believe that a man who had read 40 pages and called the work serious might speak on its behalf. He had not. She collected her cloak from the stand near the door. In the corridor behind her, she heard 2 voices, the secretary's and a younger fellow's she did not know, and then the younger voice, dropping to a register it apparently thought was private. Lady Grantham put it to Whitmore directly, apparently. Said the daughter was embarrassing herself and the manuscript wasn't worth the paper. A scholar's cast-off, she called her. Said the board would be doing the girl a kindness by refusing. The door of the society closed behind Dorothea with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She walked back to Fenwick's rooms on Strand, where he had let her the use of a small sitting room and an adjoining closet to sleep in, with a kindness she intended to repay as soon as she had anything to repay it with. She did not hurry. It was not the kind of blow that hurried you. It was the kind that slowed you down, that made each step feel considered and deliberate, because if you stopped being deliberate, you would stop being upright. She sat in Fenwick's sitting room for a quarter of an hour without taking off the cloak. The fire was small, but present. Through the thin wall she could hear Fenwick moving about in his study, shuffling papers, setting down his teacup. She pressed her hands against her face. not to weep. She was not going to weep, not today. Not here. Only to have one moment in which no one could see her face, and she did not have to arrange it. When she took her hands away, she looked at the cloak still draped around her shoulders, and she noticed for the first time, or perhaps only the first time she had attention enough to notice, the stiffness at the hem. The left side. She had mended the fraying there 2 weeks ago, badly, and the thread had given way again at the corner. But that was not what she was feeling now. What she was feeling was something inside the wool. Something folded. Something that had been there for 20 years and had never announced itself. She was still for a long moment. Then she found a small pair of mending scissors from Fenwick's sewing box, and she began to pick the stitches at the hem. The wool gave way slowly. Her hands were careful. She did not know what she expected to find, and she did not want to damage it. 3 inches, then 6. The light from the lamp on the table was thin and steady, and the room was very quiet, except for the distant sound of a cart horse on the street below. And she became aware, as she worked, that her breath had leveled to something almost like calm. Whatever was inside had been here all along. It had traveled with her father to Germany and back again, had come with her to London, had hung in 2 different cloakrooms, and absorbed the smell of a dozen evenings she had spent hoping to be taken seriously. The hem opened like a seam that had been waiting. Inside, folded into a piece of oilcloth and then into a square of cream silk, was a document. 2 documents, in fact. The first was a small square of silk, fine silk heavier than the wrapper, with something embroidered on it in gold thread. She unfolded it beneath the lamp, and the thread caught the light, and she looked at it for a long time before she understood what she was seeing. A cipher. A royal cipher, the interlocked initials of the House of Saxe-Coburg, in the formal pattern she recognized from the frontispiece of one of her father's books, a German title she had read at 12 and largely not understood. Beneath the cipher, in tiny and very careful script, signed E. Pembridge, Scholar in Residence, 1798. Her father's name. Written into the royal cipher of a German princely house. The second document was a letter, folded to the size of her palm. She unfolded it with fingers that had gone very still. It was in German. Her hands did not shake as she read it. She was too careful with the paper for that. But her breath had gone shallow, and the fire in the grate seemed very far away. The letter was dated the 14th of October, 1803, signed by Prince Friedrich August of Saxe-Coburg, and addressed to any court or academy of learning in Europe. It stated, in the formal prose of a man accustomed to his words being obeyed, that Professor Edmund Pembridge had served the Coburg court with distinction as Scholar in Residence, that his contributions to the court's musical archive were without parallel, that his scholarship was attested by the cipher attached herewith, and that his daughter, named precisely as Miss Pembridge, should she ever require the support of the prince's authority in pursuit of her father's work, bore the prince's personal commendation to any institution of learning in the civilized world. Prince Friedrich August of Saxe-Coburg was 17 years dead. She knew this. He had written this letter 12 years ago, addressed it to the world, and given it to her father, who had sewn it into the hem of a cloak and taken it with him everywhere he went and never said a word about it, and who had died in April in a small room in Bath without explaining himself, as he had, in her experience, rather frequently failed to do. She set the letter down on the table. She thought about her father, about his hands moving over manuscript pages, about his absolute inability to talk about money or planning, or the future, about the way he had looked at her when she was a child listening to him play a Bach invention at the old square piano, as though she was the one surprising thing the world had managed to produce. She thought about the fact that he had carried this document everywhere and never told her it existed. She thought about what kind of man does that. The kind of man, she decided after a long time, who believed his daughter would never need it, who believed the work would speak for itself, who had sewn the letter into the hem as a last resort and then spent 12 years assuming the last resort would never arrive. Because a man like that always believed, against all evidence, that the world would eventually recognize what was true. She sat with the letter and the silk cipher in her hands for 1 more minute. Then she folded them very carefully, put on her cloak, and went to bed. She slept 4 hours. At first light she rose, dressed, and took the 2 documents to Fenwick's study, where he was already at his desk in a state of quiet disorder. She placed the documents on top of his papers, without preamble, and waited while he read them. He was quiet for a long time. "Friedrich August's cipher," he said finally. "Yes." He looked up at her. The elderly blue of his eyes held something she had not seen in them before, a kind of restrained amazement. "You did not know this was in the cloak." "I did not." "Your father," Fenwick began, "was not a practical man," she said. "No. May I take these to the board?" Fenwick was quiet for another moment. "The board meets this morning. Oates was going to write to you today with the formal letter of refusal." He looked at the documents again. "I believe," he said slowly, "that things are about to become somewhat different." The Society's boardroom had tall windows that admitted the gray October light in thin rectangular columns, and its table was long enough to seat 14, with room for the papers and the resentments that tend to accumulate at institutional gatherings. When she entered, the door held for her by Fenwick, who had requested 5 minutes of the board's time before the morning's formal business, there were 7 men at the table, and in the chairs along the right wall, not quite in the meeting and not quite out of it, were Lady Euphemia and her niece. Gideon Ashby sat at the head of the table. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face arranged itself into the particular stillness she had come to understand was not coldness, but attention. She set the documents on the table without speaking. She placed them in front of Hartley Oates first, because he was the secretary, and the procedural order seemed important. Then she unfolded the silk and laid it beside the letter. Mr. Oates read the letter. His expression moved through several stages, the last of which was a kind of careful blankness that she had learned to interpret as the expression of a man recalibrating every assumption he has made in the last week. He passed it to the fellow on his left, who passed it to the next, and so it went around the table with a silence that was not the silence of inattention, but the silence of people reading something that was changing the room they were sitting in. "The cipher," Oates said when it reached him again. "I have seen this cipher. I have this cipher in correspondence from the Coburg court relating to a manuscript acquisition in 1809. "It is genuine," Dorothea said. Oates looked at the silk square for another moment. "It appears to be," he said, with the tightness of a man who would rather have time to verify this and is aware that time is not being offered to him. Lady Euphemia's fan had stopped moving. Miss Vane sat very straight in her chair, her pale gray eyes on the documents and then on the Duke's face. He picked up the letter last. He read it once, without visible expression. He read it a second time, more slowly. He set it down flat on the table, and he looked up at Dorothea, and the gray eyes that she had spent the last 5 days reading, for any signal of what he actually thought were steady. And still, and completely direct. She waited. She was good at waiting. He stood. "Miss Pembridge," he said in the voice he used for things that were going to be recorded, "is under my formal patronage. The matter is settled." He looked at Oates. Fenwick will witness the arrangement. I want the manuscript before the editorial board by the end of the month." The room was very quiet. Lady Euphemia Grantham looked at the silk cipher on the table, and then at the Duke, and then at her niece, and the expression that moved across her face was not quite shame and not quite capitulation, but was something in the family of both. Her fan, closed now, rested very still in her lap. Miss Vane said nothing at all. She looked at the window. The fellow who had first passed the letter along the table, a heavy-set man named Whitmore, who she had been told was the one Euphemia had addressed directly, cleared his throat. "The scholarship is evidently more significant than some of us appreciated," he said, to no one in particular. It was a small sentence doing a great deal of work, and it did not quite manage all of it. Dorothea said, "Thank you, Your Grace." She did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the room did not already know. It was 3 weeks before the manuscript was formally accepted, because 420 pages of academic annotation take time to review, even with a patron's name attached to them. During those 3 weeks, Dorothea read proofs in whatever quiet corner Fenwick's lodgings could provide, corresponded with the editorial secretary on 17 specific points of transcription, and repaid Fenwick 40 of the £62 she owed him from the advance the Society had extended against the publication. She did not see the Duke. She saw his letters. They arrived in sequence, through Oates, and they were exactly what she would have predicted, precise and sparse, directing specific corrections without explanation, occasionally noting an observation about the underlying scholarship that was not a compliment, but was not a compliment either. One note read, "The Buxtehude attribution in Chapter 9 requires a stronger citation than the one currently provided." A second note queried the transcription of example 44 contains an error in the baseline. Third measure. Once, on a small separate card she found tucked inside a corrected proof. It read only, in his spare hand, that this was important work. She had held that card for a long time in the afternoon light of Fenwick's sitting room. Then she had put it in the front pocket of her father's manuscript, which was where she kept things she needed to remember existed. On the 23rd of October, she arrived at the Society's house to sign the formal publication agreement and was directed, by an unusually cheerful Oates, not to the boardroom, but to the Duke's private study at the rear of the building. She had not been to this room before. It was smaller than she had expected. For a man of his position, a working room rather than a reception room, with papers on the desk, and a worn leather chair angled toward the fire, and books that appeared to have been read rather than displayed. On the far corner of the desk, beside an inkwell and 2 stacked pamphlets, sat a small object she recognized from some instinct she could not have named. It was a music box, silver and rosewood, with an enameled lid depicting a pastoral scene and a crack along the lid's edge that suggested it had traveled. She signed the papers. The Duke witnessed them. He handed her the second copy without sitting down, and she was about to fold it when she saw the music box again, closer now from this angle, and without thinking, with a thoughtlessness she would later attribute to the relief of a thing completed, she reached out and touched the lid. "May I?" she said. He said, "Yes," though his expression was uncertain in a way she had not previously seen on him. She wound the key. It was a small key, worn smooth, and it turned with the ease of a mechanism long maintained. She lifted the lid. The mechanism engaged, and the phrase began. She went very still. It was 8 measures of a melody she knew the way she knew her own name, which was to say that she knew it not because she had learned it, but because she had heard it before she had words, in her father's study in Bath at the old square piano, In the fragment he had always hummed when he thought no one was listening, which he had told her was from a piece he had transcribed once, a long time ago, for a German prince who collected music the way other men collected debts. She looked at the Duke. "Where did you get this?" she said. "It was my sister's," he said. "Cecily. She gave it to me some years ago. I do not know its origin. I never thought to ask, and then it seemed too late to ask. It is from a piece of music my father transcribed at the Coburg court," she said. "In 1798. It was a Baroque dance, originally, he told me. One of only 3 copies in the world." She listened to the phrase complete itself and begin again. "He used to play it at home. He played it for years." She paused. "He never told me it was the only copy." The Duke was quiet. He looked at the music box, and then he looked at her. "He did not," he said slowly, "tell you a great many things." "No," she said. "He did not." There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, not unlike the quality of the silence after the calibrated line in the boardroom, but different in register, less ceremonial, more interior, the kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. "He trusted that you would find them," the Duke said. She had thought, in the last 3 weeks, about whether this was true. She had decided it was not comfort, and was perhaps not even an explanation, but that it was accurate, and that her father's particular brand of faith, the faith of a man who believed the world would eventually recognize the truth, who had sewn a royal cipher into a hem and assumed that either it would never be needed or that when it was needed she would know to look, was not admirable, precisely, but was something she understood, was something she had inherited along with the manuscripts. "He did," she said. She was looking at the music box. The Duke was looking at her. The fire had settled into the steady low burn of a fire well tended. "There is no reason," he said, and then stopped, in the way of a man who has constructed a sentence in his own mind and found it inadequate. He tried again. "The editorial work on the manuscript will require." And he stopped. His jaw was set. His gray eyes, deep under the heavy brow, were doing something she had not seen them do before, which was to disagree with the rest of his face about what was permissible to show. "I am not in a hurry," Dorothea said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "Good," he said. It was the shortest sentence she had ever heard carry the weight it carried. Dorothea Pembridge stayed. She stayed that afternoon and into the evening, which became, by increments, and by the unspoken understanding of 2 people who are very good at reading the texts directly in front of them, the first of many evenings. Fenwick, who was not surprised by anything that had happened since she had arrived in London, and whose elderly blue eyes held a satisfaction he was too polite to express directly, had arranged months ago for her to have the use of the sitting room indefinitely. She kept it. It was useful to have her own rooms, and she was not the sort of woman to give up a useful thing before she knew it was no longer needed. By the following spring, she knew. The manuscript was published in the February of the new year, under the patronage of the Duke of Streatham, with the embroidered Coburg cipher reproduced on the dedication page. The cloak had been mended, the hem re-sewn, and the fraying sorted, and it hung on the hook beside the study door, where it had ended up one afternoon in November, and stayed because no one moved it. The cipher and the letter were kept in a velvet-lined box on the bookshelf, between a first edition of one of her father's earlier works and a pamphlet Fenwick had written 40 years ago that she had found in a second-hand shop and brought home without realizing she had done it until Gideon pointed out that she had placed it alongside the other things she was keeping. On a morning in early March, the music box played its 8-measure phrase in the still room while the snow fell outside the window, the last snow of a season ending. Soft and purposeful and brief. The fire was sufficient. The manuscript was out in the world, doing what it needed to do. The worn brown cloak hung by the door, and she could smell, faintly, if she stood close enough, the ghost of her father's tobacco in the wool. She stood close enough. The Duke of Strentham came to find her, because she had been standing by the door for 3 minutes, and he had learned, by October, to notice when she went still. He stood behind her in the doorway to the hall. He did not touch her yet. He was, in this as in other things, deliberate. He would have liked this, she said without turning. She meant the book and the room and the cipher on the page, and probably other things she was not yet ready to say directly. Yes, he said. She turned. He was close. He had been, she had noticed, finding reasons to be close, for several months, in the manner of a very controlled man who has made a decision and is executing it at the pace he has determined is correct. She did not mind his pace. She had learned his pace, the way she had learned the rhythm of the counterpoint in the manuscript, the pattern that seemed austere until you understood where the resolution was coming, and then it seemed inevitable. His hand came up and found her face. Not a performance, a fact. His thumb at the angle of her jaw, and the gray eyes looking at her the way they had looked at her across the boardroom table and across the dinner table before that, and briefly and without permission in the moment after the reception, when she had not been watching. Direct and still, and without apology. "Stay," he said. It was not the first time he had said it, and it was not going to be the last. She already knew this. She knew it the way she knew the 8 measures of the music box's phrase, not because she had been told, but because some things you recognize before you have the language for them. "Yes," she said. Behind her, the music box played on, steady and unhurried, the phrase turning on itself the way her father had meant it to turn, toward the resolution it had always been reaching for. "Thank you for staying through every measure of this story. If Dorothea's patience and her father's hidden faith moved you, leave a word below, and we will meet again in another room where something true is waiting to be seen."